In this video, you're going to learn several features available in the Sass language which will allow you to reuse certain chunks of Sass in a very easy way. So let's start with the import, which exists already in CSS, but it's slightly different in Sass. Now, if you go to a CSS file and you import another CSS file like this, followed by the path of your CSS file. So let's say that the CSS file is in the same folder, and let's call it styling.css. Then all the content of the styling.css file is going to be taken into account in the overall styling. But there is one problem here. For every single import, you're going to add one HTTP request when your page loads, and that will slow down your web page. And by the way, you can either use this syntax or place this inside the URL function like this. So that's how you do it in CSS. But again, this will add one HTTP request for every single import, right? Now, if you do that inside Sass, it's going to be different, because Sass will compile all the CSS content or the Sass content into one single CSS file, which is style.css. So in all cases, you will still have only one HTTP request for your web page, and you don't run any risk of slowing down your web page. So in a real life example, what you would have inside the structure of Sass is a list of folders. So you may have a folder called base, where you're going to place styling that affects all your different web pages. And this is normally called the boilerplate content, because it will affect every single web page in your project. So things that you will find inside the base projects are things like the styling of the typography, for example, and we'll have other files. You can also find a pages folder where you have styling that is specific to each page. So for example, I may have a file called home.scss, and that would be for my home web page. I would have another one called quotes.scss for my quotes web page in my example here, and so on, one for the sign up page, one for the contact us page. All right. Another one that you'll find in Sass projects would be called utils. And inside this one, you'll find Sass files which include things like variables, mix-ins as well, which we'll cover in a bit, functions, and so on. Now, normally, these files, they have an underscore at the beginning, which tells Sass that they are actually Sass files that you want to include inside your project. So when you include them later on in your main file, you don't have to write the extension, and you don't have to write the underscore either. So normally the name would be like this. So underscore followed by the name of the file. Another folder that you may have is called components. And by the way, you can call them anything you like, but this is just a general practice. So inside components, you can style specific components in your projects. So this includes things like buttons or other components like carousel, sliders, and so on. All right. And you'll also come across another folder, which is usually called layout. And that's where you style major sections of your website, including the header, the footer, and other sections. If you're using the CSS grid, your grid styling would go right there. All right. So let's close all these files for now. And let's take these variables and place them inside the utils folder inside variables right there. So what I need to do now is go back to the main CSS file. So I'm going to collapse all these folders. So that's our main file. And instead of having the variables there, I'm going to import the file from utils like this. And the name of the file is variables.scss. So I don't need the underscore and I don't need the extension. So let's check and make sure that our code is still working. And you can see that the colors looks fine. Now, if you want, you can place the navigation inside the components folder. So I could create a file navigation.scss and copy the styling of the navigation right there. And then I need to import the file. So it's inside components. Navigation. So again, I don't need the extension and I don't need the underscore. And it's still working fine. Well, the live preview is not working now. So let's just make sure it's activated and everything looks fine. All right, now the box sizing set to border box, that would affect all web pages. So we could place it inside the base folder. So let's create a new file. I'm going to call it, for example, base.scss. And let's import it. Now let's have a look at the compiled CSS file. So you can see the navigation at the top. You won't see anything related to the variables because they are used later on in your styling. But you will see the navigation because that's CSS styling going right there. And the base styling is this one. All right. Okay, now let's move to another feature of Sass, which is called extend. So the extend feature can be used with the extend directive, which looks like this. And this will help you inherit styles from another property. Well, to make things easy to grasp, I'm going to create a few buttons at the end of the document. So let's place some text inside the buttons. So the first one is going to be default, then success, warning, and error. And let's give the success one a class of button success. And then this one a class of button warning. And this one button error. So I'm going to add some styling to these buttons with some background colors. So let's select the success button and give it a green background color. Okay, let's delete this so that our code or our Sass works. All right, so that's better. And then let's move to the next button and give it an orange background. And finally the error button. And let's give it a red-ish color. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's change the text color inside the button to white and also make the text bigger. And make the border radius set to something like 4 pixels. All right. Also, let's remove the border. So border none. And let's turn the cursor to a pointer when we hover on the button. Okay, so that looks perfect. Now we need the same styling for the other buttons. So normally what you would do here is take this styling and then place it as the styling of all these buttons. So you would normally select all the buttons. So button success, then button warning, then button error, and then you place that styling right there. Correct? Well, that's how you would do that in CSS. But in Sass, there is another way of doing this using extends. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new class called button common. And inside this class, I'm going to put the common styling between all buttons. Then I'm going to go back to the buttons, remove that, and then inside each button, I'm going to include that piece of styling inside each button. So to do that, I'm going to use the extend directive followed by the class button common. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other two buttons. And I still get the same results. Now, if you look at the final CSS file, you will see that we've got a specific styling for each button. So each button has got its own background color. And then you've got right there all our buttons selected, and you've got that styling affected to each of them. But what's interesting here is that we also have this selector in our final CSS, although we don't really need it because we don't have any element in our HTML code with a class that is called button common. So if you want to get rid of that, instead of using a class with a dot, you can use a percentage. So using a percentage will make sure you don't have that extra element in your CSS file. So if I check again, that selector has just disappeared because it's not a real class. All right, so that's a good way of getting rid of that extra selector in your final CSS file and reducing its size. Now, a quick comment about the extend directive. You can nest it, meaning that inside this styling, you can actually use another extend which inherits another piece of code. So for example, let's go for a button wide class, which makes the width of the button set to 50%. You can actually inherit that inside button common, which will make all our buttons quite wide, and you're inheriting button common right there. So we're extending button common, and button common itself is extending button wide. All right. Otherwise, if you don't want to use it right there and you want to use it, for example, only for button success, then you just go to button success and you extend both the button common and the button wide right there. So only the success button is going to be wide like that. All right. Now, hopefully you are comfortable with the import directive and the extend directive. Now we're going to move to another directive called mixin, and that is something we're going to cover in the next video.